Hello, everyone. It is so great to be with you today. This is the earliest I have ever been dressed in work clothing. It's 5 a.m. here, but this talk is so important. I think I've got you for about half an hour, and I'm going to share with you as much information as I possibly can about applying the startup way and the lessons that I learned trying to take Eric Ries's latest book and apply those lessons in working with organizations of all sizes that are trying to be innovative. And I really appreciate what the prior speakers were saying about enabling failure and creating situations where we can take structured risks and being more innovative. But I want to ask a question, and this is kind of an interesting one, which is that most startups fail. Most startups fail spectacularly. And I was actually just this last evening coaching a bunch of young entrepreneurs that were very interested in starting new companies. Most of them are not going to be successful. So what actually are the things that we're trying to copy that successful startups do? In this talk, I'm going to explore those techniques that make some small number of startups disproportionately good at what it is that they do. Now, before I do that, it's probably worth introducing myself just a little bit more. My career has been filled with pretty major failures. I happen to have one of the only things of value that I still have from working at this company, Curb. Now, by show of hands, how many of you have heard of this company? Nobody. Okay. And a few people. Okay. Hey, in the front row. Thank you. So, and by show of hands, how many of you have heard of the company that 2 years later, after we had gotten started, completely ate our lunch and put us out of business? And that is Uber. Anybody heard of Uber? Right? And most people have heard of Uber. Very few people have heard of Curb. And yet, we had a 2-year head start. We got you a real, licensed, unquestionably legal taxi driver at a time when it was actually pretty magical that you could use your phone and an app on your phone to get a taxi. And yet, with this incredible head start, we had been featured in the App Store and by Apple. We were growing tremendously, rapidly. We still lost. And it was because we were building all of the wrong things. So just because you're a startup doesn't mean that you're destined for success. And in fact, startups fall victim to the same problems that large companies fall victim to. And so I want to shift our language a little bit from thinking perhaps less about operating more like a startup and operating more like a modern company. And what does it even mean to operate like a modern company? Now, this book, The Startup Way, when I picked it up, I thought it was going to be filled with all kinds of new tools and techniques for practicing the lean startup. And for those of you who are not familiar with the lean startup, the methodology in its essence is very simple. The idea behind the lean startup is that we can do something, anything less than building the whole thing, that would teach us whether or not the whole thing is worth building. When we take risks, we do so in a manner such that the failure condition is very small. If something goes wrong, we didn't lose $10 million, $100 million, years of effort. We lose a fraction of the time because that's all it took to learn the one thing that we needed to learn to determine, is this worth further pursuit? So with that said, although I expected to get a whole bunch of new lean startup techniques within this book, in fact, it is about how to make a modern company. And what are the things that modern companies are doing that traditional companies are not? And even startups can operate like a traditional company. Taxi Magic, which later rebranded to Curb, which failed spectacularly to Uber, is a prime example of a company that operated with a traditional mindset, even though we had some of the most talented people that I will probably ever have the pleasure of working with. If the environment in which those individuals are operating is not promoting and encouraging productive failure in which we learn successfully, even if our idea was wrong, then we're going to get into trouble. Now, the reason that we need to change the way we think about how our companies operate is because the marketplace has fundamentally changed. But what's weird here is that the way we structure our companies and the way we rally around the work and the way that we organize has not changed significantly over the last 100 years, which is kind of funny when you think about it. And the premise here for what is so much more different now than the world that we were in before is that it is even more uncertain. We are way less likely than we were in the past to be able to predict whether or not someone would actually use a product or service that we build, right? And you probably remember in 1999, you could build a website and it could look really bad. And just because you built it, it did something novel, people would use it. And that was incredible, right? But we're no longer in that time. We're no longer in that era. The question is no longer, can we build this product or service, but should we? If we build this product or service, is anyone going to care? And that is harder to predict than ever before. Now, when I present this slide, I almost always encounter some amount of resistance where people say, hey, wait a minute. Look, I had an analytics manager come up to me when I was presenting and they said, hey, I have more data than I have ever had. And everyone has access to more data than they've ever had. So isn't the world more certain? Isn't it more predictable? And while data is great, looking at market studies and surveys is potentially interesting and informative. Just because we have data doesn't mean it's telling a complete story. And the question I would ask is, how can we collect data that emulates or represents the actual behavior that we want to see being performed by a customer, rather than looking at generic market sizing data and that kind of stuff? But to perhaps best illustrate that we are in this marketplace of uncertainty, I like to show this one tweet by Kylie Jenner. Is anyone familiar with this tweet? Has anyone seen this? So this tweet, while seemingly, I don't know, is it that big a deal? Kylie Jenner, who is a celebrity, says, so does anyone else not open Snapchat anymore? Or is it just me? Ugh, this is so sad. Right? I mean, that was my best Kylie Jenner impression here, okay? So, but she made this tweet. Does anyone know what happened to Snapchat's market value after this tweet? It plummeted. In one tweet, Kylie Jenner wiped out $1.3 billion of Snapchat's market value. This was not a thing they could predict, right? So if the world is more uncertain, moving more quickly than ever before, and perhaps this is a little bit a tongue-in-cheek example, right? It's not a perfect representation of the type of uncertainty that I'm really referring to, but I think it's illustrative of the fact that it is hard to predict what is going to happen next. And our traditional management structures are not very good at positioning us for success and responding to these sorts of situations. So when we talk about a traditional company, there's really three layers that I want to evaluate. One is the nature of work, which is that in a traditional company, people are kind of order takers. Some senior leader says, you go and work on this project, and they hand it off to some other manager, and the manager goes and they run off with it and they hand it off to a team. The nature of work is all about rule following and being loyal. And success is perceived as your ability and willingness to make sacrifices to climb the corporate ladder. And I imagine that, none of the places you've ever worked were like this, but, the nature of an enterprise is such that talent is plentiful. We can always find somebody else. And this is how a traditional company is structured. And I don't know about you, but like that to me does not sound like the most exciting place to work. Now let's compare this and contrast it a little bit to what we might consider to be a modern company. And when we talk about being more like a startup, these are really the things that we mean. When we talk about the nature of work, it is not following orders, but it is figuring out how to systematically learn about the things that we want to go do so that we can take more intelligent risks and so that we can learn very rapidly and basically create a situation where we reduce the uncertainty. The nature of work is very different. You're no longer an order taker, but someone who is expected to operate like an entrepreneur. And by the way, not that you needed my permission here, but you are all officially knighted to behave as entrepreneurs within your organizations. Now, the nature of the enterprise is also fundamentally different, where instead of thinking as people as being somewhat replaceable, we want to create systems within our organization that create the right structure for people to be operating in entrepreneurial ways, in productive ways, successfully. Now, the good news, my friends, if I've convinced you that perhaps a modern company is an interesting place to work, the layers that we need to look at of a traditional company are the same layers that we could look at for a modern company. And these are the 4 different layers that we'll be looking at. And that is accountability, process, culture, and people. And if you're trying to change your organization to be more like a modern company, to be more like one of those startups that is wildly successful, I would argue that these are the levers that we need to be looking at. And frankly, personally, when I travel around the world teaching lean startup, I fall back on this diagram, perhaps more than any other tool or technique, because it is so helpful in diagnosing why we are or aren't able to create a situation in which people behave entrepreneurially, in which people can operate in that risk-taking, structured learning manner. Now, if you were trying to change an organization to be more like a modern company, you would work your way from the bottom up in this pyramid. And I'll explain why, and I'll do so by sharing a series of stories about teams I have worked with, organizations that I have worked with, that were trying to do the exact same thing you're trying to do right now, which is to be more innovative, to have disruptive, next level, game-changing breakthroughs for your organizations. And so the first story I want to talk about is about accountability and the ways in which accountability can profoundly accelerate or interfere with your ability to drive innovative work. Now, it's probably not too surprising, but when we talk about accountability here, the thing that we're really referring to is the rules and systems in which we hire people, we fire people, we praise people, we promote them, we reward them, and so forth. What are the things that we hold people accountable to delivering? To give an example of an organization where the accountability structure was perhaps broken, there was a team where I was working with that was in the US government. And you know, this is funny because within the US, people don't think of the government as being particularly innovative or fast moving. But the reality from my working with several government organizations is perhaps some of the most innovative people are working there. But does the system that they work in enable them to be successful? So I was working with an organization that had an innovation challenge, and some number of teams could go and pitch their ideas and would get funded. And the members of those teams could go spend 50% of their time working on an innovation project. And I got to coach one of those teams, which was really exciting, one of the winners of these contests. But very rapidly, this team encountered a problem. Any idea what that might be? If you think about it, a team that has now 50% of their time to go work on an innovation project. What could go wrong? Well, it turns out the managers of those individuals were still responsible for the same amount of work getting done. Now, wait a minute. If the manager still is responsible for the full amount of work getting done, but some amount of their staff is now off going and doing other stuff, what do you think the manager is going to do when that person tries to go work on innovation work? They're going to tell them not to do it. And that was exactly what happened. And who is, by the way, reviewing the performance of those individuals? It's not the organizers of the innovation event, it's their manager. So did they get particularly good results from this program? I would argue they were not as good as they could have been because the accountability structures were totally broken in this situation. Right? And it's not a malicious thing. It's not like someone intended to design it that way, but it's very easy to end up creating really a game that doesn't work in the way that we expected. To give another example, and this is from the startup way and was an experience that Eric Ries had, when he was working at and working with General Electric, he was working with a team of engineers. And in the performance evaluation for those engineers, they got sort of negative marks, negative feedback if they had rework, if they had to rewrite code. And while in a traditional company, that makes a lot of sense, right? Rework might be an indication that you didn't do a good job in the first place. If you're running experiments, if you're building small things that help you learn whether or not you're headed in the right direction with the intention of rebuilding them, well, running experiments just seems like a really bad idea. Because in your performance review, when you go back and you rework that code in subsequent experiments, it looks like you didn't do a good job because you had tons of reworked code. And so those engineers had a hard time behaving entrepreneurially because the rules in which they were operating were not set up to create a successful outcome. And while that might sound weird, that might sound like, oh, Elliot, I doubt that's happening within my organization. My experience has been that within almost every organization I coach, the accountability structures are broken and do not actually enable innovation. And it does not matter how much you say, go be innovative, think more like a startup. Our culture enables, risk-taking or whatever. It doesn't matter how good your process is, how good the culture is, or what people you have on the field if the accountability system is totally broken. Now, the next layer I want to look at is process. What is the process by which work is done within our organizations? And to what extent does it truly enable innovative behavior? Now, I described earlier this company Curb, which was formerly named Taxi Magic. And at the time, I was running technology for this tech startup. We had about 100 people. And I mentioned that these were some of the most brilliant, innovative people that I have ever and probably will ever work with. They went on to go and run technology for large organizations. They wrote books. They've been tremendously successful in the things they've done since they left Curb. So why is it that with some of the most innovative people that I have ever been in a room with, we weren't being particularly innovative? And I would argue that although our software development process was pretty good, and it took us a long way from where we were previously, it didn't actually allow for a new idea to emerge. And does this sound at all familiar? Where even though we were only a 100-person company, if someone had an interesting idea, you had to go and play the politics game and socialize it and convince enough people it was a good idea before it could see the light of day, not based on data, but based on your ability to maneuver socially and convince people that it was a good idea and worth doing. Well, that is very similar to how most corporations end up operating really with regard to the emergence of innovative ideas. There's no full proper system for them to emerge successfully. There's no process. And so something that we did during my time there is we completely changed the team structure. We created a world in which anyone could present an idea as long as they had data to prove that it was a thing worth doing. And we had a master list of projects where each person could present an idea, anyone in the company, even an intern, even someone who was just there for the summer and they were like, working as a part of a program through school and they were partnering with us for that. They could present an idea if they had data proving that it was a thing that was worth doing. And all of a sudden, when we opened up the floodgates to those ideas, really incredible stuff emerged from all over the company. And there was actual data supporting it. It wasn't opinion-based decision-making, but data-based decision-making. And look, for the ideas that sounded really interesting, where we didn't have data, could we create a situation where we could learn about whether or not we were headed in the right direction? That we could gather some amount of information that would be a leading indicator to prove to us that it was a thing worth pursuing. When we changed the process, the emergence and the quality of the emergence of those ideas changed profoundly. Does not matter that it was a startup when the process was broken. Now, this next term, I want to help define for us as we think through the rest of the day, and that is culture. Now, the reason this is after process and accountability is it really doesn't matter what your culture is or what you want it to be if those other layers are not supporting entrepreneurship. But with that said, I would define culture as the set of values by which decisions are made. And I'm going to say that again because that's a definition that most people might not have heard before or have used. Your cultural values are the values that drive decisions within your organization. Let me give a couple examples of how that works well. At one point I guess this was not that long ago, a couple of years ago, I was working at a tech startup. I was running product, tech, and growth. And we had just gone through an exercise where we had documented what our cultural values were. Now, it's worth mentioning, just because we write them down doesn't mean that that's the actual values of the organization, right? Those are the espoused values, the things that we hope people will embody. And when several of the team members encountered a difficult situation, in this case, there was a production outage. Some small number of our customers would be impacted by an issue with our technology. These engineers had a choice. They could put a message on our website, which might look kind of weird to the people who aren't experiencing the issue at all. Or they could focus on the millions of things they needed to go do so that we could keep getting funding and exist as a company. One of our core values, however, was transparency. One of our core values was transparency. And they looked at those values and they said, if we value transparency, then the most important thing that we need to do right now is show to our customers, hey, look, we have an issue. We're sorry. We'll let you know when it's fixed, and to be transparent about it. And no senior leader had to be present to make that decision. All they had to do was look at our values and then make a call. To give another example of how cultural values can profoundly accelerate your ability to behave more like a startup, and hopefully, I'm encouraging you to think of it not as much about thinking and behaving like a startup, but behaving like a modern company. Is when I was at this same startup, someone kept using this phrase, we should just do this, it's low-hanging fruit, right? And this idea of something being low-hanging fruit means it's easy to do. And I said, hey, look, team, just because something is easy to do doesn't mean it's the right thing to do right now. And, to take sort of a related tangent from my story, I think we are actually in the middle of a crisis, an urgency crisis, where we have forgotten what it means to operate with urgency within organizations, right? And this is a part of why it's hard or it feels like progress within large organizations is so slow, is that there is so much stuff to do. There are so many people to talk to that we lose track of doing the one most important thing, the only thing that matters at this exact moment in time. And when I explained this to the team, they said, I guess you don't mean low-hanging fruit like an apple you can pick very easily off of a tree, but you mean more like a watermelon, right? And then somebody else said, no, they don't mean like a watermelon, they mean like a jackfruit. And a jackfruit is like this big, ugly, heavy thing that's kind of spiky, right? And we coined this phrase called eating the jackfruit, which referred to this idea that we would do the most important thing at this exact moment in time, because that is all that matters. And that became one of our cultural values. We eat the jackfruit. And we use that in our daily language about doing the thing that might not be fun, might not be what you want to work on right now, might not be what's easy, but is the thing that is most important in moving our business forward at this exact moment in time. And that is all that matters. Why is that all that matters? Because if you go forward and do other work on a project, but your most important assumptions are false, the most important components aren't set up for success or won't work, it doesn't matter that you did all those other things. It was all wasted effort. Now, we started going to different recruiting events, and we would have people come up to our booth for recruiting and say, I've seen the information about your company. I saw your culture deck. I want to eat the jackfruit, right? And it became a recruiting tool. And that story became a very powerful thing. And I would argue that in a modern company, we use stories that exemplify our cultural values to illustrate to others what it is that we want people to do. And that's not just a thing that, Elliot is saying was happening at a startup that he happened to work at, but very successful companies do this as well. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the company Zappos. Zappos sells shoes online. And I'm pretty sure that on a yearly cadence, on a yearly basis, they publish a book, a culture book full of stories from employees that from the eyes of the employee exemplify the values of the company. And if you actually go to Amazon.com and you look it up, you can even buy their culture book. So culture is something that can profoundly accelerate your ability to operate like a modern company. And the cultural elements that we're frequently referring to are your relationship with risk-taking and your relationship with failure. I'll talk more about those two particular elements in a second. Now, the last piece of this pillar, which is very important, but is the smallest piece, by the way. It's at the top. It's the last thing that Eric or I would recommend that you go tackle, which is people. Now, you might be scratching your head a little bit and say, wait a minute, Elliot. Like, if I want to be a more entrepreneurial company, I need to go hire people that think this way and get them to convince everybody else that we should behave differently. And hopefully by showing you this pyramid, you can see the fallacy of that. You can see why that will never work. Because no amount of innovative people in a broken environment will generate innovative outcomes. And I want to share a couple examples here. One example is with a team in the US government. And this project was unequivocally the most interesting, exciting, game-changing project I have ever coached. And this was a team in the government that was doing what's kind of perceived to be perhaps a boring project, but they were told, you're going to implement an RFID system for our warehouses. An RFID system is a radio frequency ID. It's very well known that RFID systems make warehouses operate more efficiently and enable you to generate really positive outcomes when you're restructuring the way a warehouse works. But when I sat down with this team, I said, so have you done like a Google search to see what else is out there besides RFID? And they gave me this funny look. They were like, what do you mean? Done a Google search to see if there's other options. We were told to work on an RFID system. And I said, so you mean to tell me that your manager is only happy if you build an RFID system and that all the other things you might do to generate better outcomes for your warehouse don't matter? So they went back to their manager, and their manager said, no, yes. If you can do anything that generates better outcomes, we will be happy. We think RFID is a part of that solution, but what do you think we should go and do? Now, this is the equivalent, as I was saying earlier, of my officially knighting you to behave entrepreneurially, right? The exact same people who were given a different context and told, do whatever you think is important to figure out what the right things are, generated profoundly different outcomes, because on their original trajectory, they would have put together a recommendation for RFID that would take 2 years. It would be, $1 billion plus project. And it would be like 5 years before we get any results whatsoever. But instead, they started running lean startup style experiments. They started talking to the people who worked in the warehouse, talking to the people who organized the warehouses, talking to the people who needed things from the warehouses. And they figured out a whole bunch of things that they could go do immediately to generate massive change. Because, as it turns out, technology had advanced a whole heck of a lot, but the processes within their warehouses hadn't changed. And they actually took off-the-shelf technology with a teeny amount of custom coding and created their own devices for working with things in the warehouse that was so impactful that other teams within the organization started to hear from warehouse workers who were so excited about how their lives were so much easier using these devices, which were incredibly cheap, incredibly simple to create with off-the-shelf technology, right? They started getting requests for that from all around different parts of this government organization. I tell this story because the exact same people with a slightly different context, with a slightly different prompt from their manager, generated worlds different outcomes. And we're talking about millions of dollars of savings, right? Like unbelievable amounts of time, all by changing the accountability, the process, and in many ways, the expectations and culture on a team. So if I have perhaps convinced you that these things work, and well, wait a minute, let me give you one more story, actually. Let me give you one story about a time where we actually did need to change the people. Because sometimes you do need to change the people. I don't want to give the wrong impression there. There are times where you need to do that, but I've only seen this once in my entire career. And this was actually at the very beginning of my career when I was working at a consulting firm. We were doing waterfall software development. This is where you try to plan the whole project, and you might be doing like a year of software development and you plan the whole thing up front. Can't imagine what could possibly go wrong with that, right? So we were doing waterfall and we were switching to a technique called agile. And in agile software development, the developers get to pick and choose what they want to work on from the most important things at the top of a list of priorities. And when I was working at this consulting firm, we used to rank every single employee against their peers. So one of the people on my team was the #2 software developer on our broader team of like 35 engineers. The #2 developer. And when he heard that we wanted to go to waterfall, he came up to me and he said, Elliot, I don't think I could do it. I don't think I can handle the uncertainty of having to pick and choose for myself what I'm going to work on. I just want to be told what to do. No kidding. I couldn't believe it. And before we even tried Agile, before we had even switched, this person left the organization. The idea of having to think for themselves in selecting work, they didn't want it. And they left. That is the only time in my career I have seen a need for the people or players on the field to change. Okay. So if we take a big step back and we analyze what is different in a modern company versus a traditional company, I want to talk about these practices and behaviors that modern companies do that for me were really game changing, that for me really shifted the way that I think about how a large organization can do work. And the first thing I want to call your attention to is metered funding. And this technique is very powerful. Now, in a traditional company, you might say, hey, we've got a cool idea. Let's go spend $5 million in 5 years and see if it works, right? Not to be sarcastic again, but like, can't imagine why that would ever go wrong, right? With metered funding, we take the opposite approach. Instead of saying the value you must generate is building the product or service, we instead say the value you must generate is a small amount of learning. We want for you to learn the most important thing, the one thing we must know right now to make it worth further investment in this idea. And so with metered funding, we give you a small amount of time and a small amount of money to do whatever it is you think you need to do to get a small amount of learning. And at the conclusion of that small amount of time, you meet with a group of people called a growth board. And that growth board is a set of people who are trained to evaluate that style of learning. And you present to that group, typically it's senior leaders within an organization, people who are decision makers, stakeholders, who can fund subsequent rounds. And you talk about the learning that you got. Now, spoiler alert, most of the time you learn the idea wasn't any good. And that instead of doing this original idea, maybe there's this other thing we should go and do instead. And that growth board can then fund the idea or not. I really like this approach because it profoundly reduces the risk associated with these innovation projects, right? And earlier the speakers talked about risk taking. And it's true that we're taking risks, but we are doing so intelligently by minimizing the impact of being wrong. Now, at the next layer that I want to talk about is around process. And specifically, in a modern company, the processes we use generate scientific learning. And that's right, my friends, we can actually apply the scientific method to learning whether or not our business idea is any good. And I know that this is like falling back on the early stages of your education in science, where you wrote down a hypothesis about what was true and what isn't. But it has been my experience that teams that actually document, here is what we think is true of the world, and create structured small experiments to learn about those things, do really well in figuring out whether or not they're headed in the right direction. And in a modern company, we shift our processes from being about sort of stage gate approval processes to creating a world in which we can experiment rapidly and at speed. Now, this next layer, culture, I mentioned I would talk about this more. And there are some major shifts in the way that we think about learning and the way that we think about failure. In a traditional company, we avoid failure like the plague because it means somebody is getting fired. In a modern company, we create a world in which failure is celebrated if at the conclusion of that failure, you learn something, if it was a productive failure. Because most ideas go through several iterations of failure before they're any good. And by the way, most ideas sound really stupid. Like the very best ones sound really stupid. And you've got to run some experiments to prove that they're worth doing. Let me give an example. Uber, billion-dollar company, right? The premise of Uber is get in a car with a stranger. You know that thing your parents told you to never do? How about this one? Airbnb, multi-billion-dollar company. It's a company that lets you sleep on a stranger's air mattress. And yes, at the founding of this company, they had to have an air mattress, right? Sleep in a stranger's house, right? That sounds like the stupidest idea you've ever heard. And yet we'd love to be the CEO of a company like that. So is it any surprise that within our large organizations, where everyone is trying to avoid failure, that the very best ideas, which probably sound stupid, are killed before they have a chance to see the light of day? The cultural values of the organization are critical in creating a world in which truly exceptional, disruptive ideas can emerge. Now, at this last layer, the people layer, the thing that I want to emphasize is cross-functional teams. Now, cross-functional in this case means that the team has all of the core skill sets it needs to be successful. We move out of a world in which, oh, I need to go talk to a designer, and they got to go wait until the design team has time. And now I need to go get engineers, and you wait for an engineering organization to start to work with you. But the team has all of the skills it needs within it and has the authority to use the money they've been allocated in whatever way they see fit to generate the right outcomes. And, look, to a big organization, that might sound kind of scary, right? Like they could go spend the money, go into Vegas, gambling it all away. And yes, they have the authority to go and do that. But guess what? You're going to fire those people if they make that choice. And it was a small amount of money anyways. And the reality is that most people, given the opportunity to behave entrepreneurially, will use that money wisely, especially when you give them a small amount of training in how to think about incremental experimentation. So if we're to take a big step back and say, okay, Elliot, I get these layers of how a modern company ticks, how it works, how it thinks. What are the guiding principles by which it operates? And Eric has presented 5 key principles. And I love these for how succinctly they convey what it is that a modern company must do. And this first idea is continuous innovation. We are no longer in a world in which you can have one innovative idea and that propels you for the next 100 years, right? That drives your success for a very large period of time. Once that was true, by the way, I'll tell a story about that. So in the 1920s or 1930s, General Motors, company that was producing cars, that was very small compared to their biggest competitor, and that at the time was Ford. General Motors was struggling, and they almost went out of business because they mismatched their predictions for demand with the reality of what demand looked like. And an individual by the name of Alfred Sloan came along, and he became the CEO of this company. And he created a way of predicting demand based on past demand. So you would predict future demand based on past demand in a way that was innovative and hadn't been done before. And by the way, companies still use those techniques today. But we are no longer in a world in which a breakthrough idea that you have is going to last 100 years. Because now, if you've got an innovative idea, you've got the risk that a competitor is going to copy it, that they're going to do it better than you, that some company in some other part of the world is going to be a copycat that can do it cheaper and faster because of where they're located. There are dozens of reasons why a single innovation is no longer what you need. What you need is an engine that can generate innovative ideas and can vet those ideas rapidly, because the best ideas are going to sound really stupid. And so are the really bad ideas. So you got to create an engine that continuously and rapidly can test them to figure out what is actually worth pursuing. And to do that, keying into the second principle, we need to create teams that can operate autonomously, that can do whatever they need to do, that have the decision authority to do whatever they need to do to learn the one thing they must learn right now. And I'll give an example of a time where I worked at a company that didn't do this very well. This was when I was at AOL. And I know I'm dating myself by talking about how I used to work at America Online. But I worked on and got to build out a research and development team, an R&D team from scratch. I got to hire the staff. I got to pick the projects. And we were given a broad charter. We were told, do whatever you want to generate new users and to create revenue. Pretty exciting, right? But we had to report to the CEO of the organization that we worked in on a weekly basis, and often more frequent than that. Let me ask you a question. What startup are you aware of or have you heard of that has to report to its board on a weekly or daily basis? This is like absurdity, right? This is complete absurdity. And yet, in most large organizations, that's how we treat innovation projects. We spent more time status reporting than we did running experiments. We spent more time politicking than we did running experiments, right? So you need to be able to create small units that have cross-functional teams that can do whatever it is they need to prove that their idea is worth pursuing further. I really love this quote from one of my colleagues, Teague Hopkins, who says, VCs, venture capitalists, can make a multi-million-dollar decision in less than 48 hours. If you can't too, you're falling behind. By the way, how do we make a multi-million-dollar decision within a large organization in less than 48 hours? How would I recommend doing that? Very simple, my friends. By making it a much smaller decision. Instead of saying, we're going to spend all these millions of dollars funding a big project, would we be comfortable spending a small amount of money with a small team for a small amount of time to get a small amount of learning? And those are decisions that you need to structure yourself to be able to make very, very quickly. This, when you start to think about who it is that funds those projects and how those things start to happen, highlights for us that there is a part of our organization that is missing. By show of hands, how many of you have a chief entrepreneurship or chief innovation officer at your company? Show of hands. A single person who is senior and responsible for innovation. Very few. I actually was coaching an organization, teaching them lean startup principles, and a very senior leader within that organization, he was the sponsor for bringing me in, came up to me and he said, Elliot, I went to the CEO and I said, I should run the innovation function and we need to have one. And the CEO said, no, we don't need an innovation function. Everyone is responsible for innovation. True story. True story. This actually happened. Now I want to run something by you to see if this sounds a little bit crazy. If I said to you, oh, no, we don't need a chief financial officer or a finance organization. Everyone is responsible for intelligent financial decisions. That would sound insane, right? We don't have a chief marketing officer. Everyone is responsible for creating intelligent, on-brand, on-messaging advertising for our organization whenever they work on a project, right? That would sound insane. And yet most of our organizations, we have this weird equivalent of the phrase, no, everyone is responsible for being entrepreneurial here. Well, that doesn't work particularly well. And if you want to build sophistication around being innovative, then you know, it might be wise to have someone whose sole responsibility is that activity. Whose sole responsibility is that activity. Now, when we think about creating that world in which there is someone who is responsible for entrepreneurship and creating systems within a company that promote entrepreneurship, I want to just give one example of an organization that did this really, really well. And that is a company called Intuit. And they create online tax software, right? You can fill out your taxes online. And this is a really awesome piece of software. And within this company, they created their own system for innovation. And they call it, they have training that they call Lean Start In. You know, it's a play off of their name, which is Intuit. and they train those employees, and those employees get some small percentage of their time to work on innovative projects. They also have a system. It's an internal website where you can pitch an idea. You can say, hey, I've got a project and I need these skills. And there are people who can go and look at that website and say, I have these skills, I'm looking for a project. And you kind of recruit teams that go work on stuff. It was that system where they first built a mobile app for doing your taxes. At the time that they did this, the idea that you would use a mobile app to do taxes was insane. And yet, the team that did that ended up building the foundation of the mobile app that later became extremely successful for Intuit. So if you create this function effectively, and there's a lot of ways that you can go and do that, you can start to get better entrepreneurial outcomes for your organization. But as you might imagine, a lot has to change within an organization if you are creating a brand new branch, a brand new sub-organization within that company. A lot changes. And Eric refers to this as the second founding. The restructuring of that pyramid we showed you earlier, of the accountability, the process, the culture, the people, so that it can actually behave entrepreneurially. And that is a very painful change, as you might imagine. Any of you who have been through a change management experience or a major organizational change know that that is a very, very, very painful time, much like the founding of the company could be. And that is why it's called the second founding, because it is almost like you are founding the company all over again to behave in a more entrepreneurial way. Now, Eric tells a really compelling story about this, where he had a famous Silicon Valley CEO come to him and say, Eric, I have this really weird problem. I funded a project that was supposed to be like a game changer for our company, exploring new areas that we could grow into. And I just checked in with this team. They had 6 months to work on it. And they have not done a single experiment yet. And when I talked to them, they said, oh yeah, we almost have approval from legal and marketing and branding and all of these other groups to go run our first experiment. And the CEO said, like, team, like if I had founded this company with the same mindset you have right now, like you would not be here, this company would not exist. And so it does not matter that the company started in an entrepreneurial way. It is very, very easy to lose sight of that way of working, of that style of modern company management as the organization grows. And so even organizations that started out being very, very sophisticated in this way, if you're not careful, can end up looking more like traditional organizations. It does not matter that you say you're a startup. It does not matter that your origin was once a startup. Now, the last principle, which is very important, is continuous transformation, which is the idea that, look, like lean startup and the startup way are certainly not the last management disciplines that are going to come along. In fact, I hope that lots of new exciting management disciplines come along and advance our thinking in how we do work. So an organization should build the muscles to test, evaluate, learn whether or not new methodologies and approaches actually work for you. And that is what this principle is referring to. The idea that we can build the muscles for evaluating what we should be doing next. Okay. If I have convinced you, and I hope that I have, that you want to be more like a modern company than a traditional company, there are 3 phases that are recommended for transforming your company to behave this way. Because if the CEO were to walk in tomorrow and say, we're going to be modern companies, we're going to behave entrepreneurially, I don't think it's going to go particularly well. In fact, typically, this sort of movement does not start with the CEO. It starts with people who are doing the work on the front lines and feel the pain the most. Now, the first phase is called critical mass. Critical mass is where we have some number of projects, where we have teams that are operating by exception. They are given permission to not follow the standard rules for accountability, the standard processes, the standard cultural guidelines. They're given full reign to do the things they need to do to be successful, so that we can get some amount of data indicating that lean startup or these modern practices work within our company, within our industry, within our context. One of my favorite quotes is from an individual by the name of Edward Deming. And he said, "In God we trust, all others must bring data." And so this critical mass phase is all about getting that data that proves it works here. Once you have done that, then you can start to think about how to scale lean startup or whatever methodology you are using for modern management. And you can start to spread it to other teams. But still at this point, we don't try to change on a company-wide, enterprise-wide basis the layers of that pyramid, because it would be too challenging to do. And what you will be more likely to encourage is the organizational antibodies, the people who fight change because they've been doing it this way forever, or the people who stand to lose the most. They're going to jump in and they're going to kill your idea. They're going to kill the movement before it can actually be successful, because you don't have enough data yet to show that it works at scale. So you start to scale it up, you gather data at that layer. Then and only then do you look at the deep systems within the organization, the deep rules for how people are hired, fired, promoted, the deep processes that dictate how things are done, the broader cultural norms and guidelines and values, and changing them for everyone. Then and only then do you make those changes, which, by the way, after you've done the critical mass phase, after you've scaled it up a bit, you're much better positioned to make smarter decisions about what those things ought to be. So, my friends, we have covered a lot of ground. This has kind of been a whirlwind tour of the ideas that are contained within the startup way and my experiences applying them on the front line as a practitioner. I am eager to hear what you think of these ideas. And please do feel free to send us an email at education@leanstartup.co if you have a question as a follow-up to what I presented. And I know in a moment we'll probably have some time for maybe one or two questions from the audience, but I want to present an idea to you, which is that if you've been knighted as an entrepreneur, right? If you've been knighted as an entrepreneur and you've just been given permission to email a presenter to ask questions, you should beat my door down. I should have to fend you off with all these questions, right? But it has been my experience that leaders within corporations and workers within corporations and enterprises don't understand how to behave like a fiercely entrepreneurial individual taking advantage of every single resource coming their way. So please do not hesitate to send me an email with questions. And with that said, I'm going to hand it off to the team where you are to see if we have time to field one or two questions.
Hi, Elliot. Thank you. Thank you so much for this. I wish my brain worked this good at 5 a.m. So, wow, this was amazing. Thank you so much.
And you too can have a brain that works this well at 5 a.m.
Yes, and we will work on it. Okay, now we have time for two short questions. We will be fast. So, George will pose the first question.
So, Elliot, how you perform innovation in organization without involving management? It seems like that from your examples and from my experience, it does not work. It does work, sorry. So it was posed by an anonymous, I guess why.
Yes, they don't want to be identified because if they reveal who they are, their managers will hunt them down and destroy them. Which is what managers exist to do within large organizations: hunt, risk, and destroy it. Yes, it is possible, and often teams think that they need to create what, at least here, we call like a skunk works operation. A team that is off doing their own thing, secretly performing innovative work, because if a manager were to hear about it, they would kill the idea. And you can go and you can do that. You can go and you can do that, but the problem is that you're always at risk of being shut down. And so if that is the way that you have to operate, I would propose that instead you do so in the open. And you do so by saying, hey, manager, we've got this idea. We think it's really excellent. Will you fund us this small amount of money, this small amount of time, so that we can see if it is worth pursuing further and getting data? And look, the reality is that in a lot of organizations, the best ideas are going to sound stupid, and managers exist to kill stupid ideas. It's not going to get very far that way. And so navigating a situation where you don't have management support is actually very challenging. It's actually very challenging. And I actually have a colleague who used to say that if you cannot convince your management that working in this way is a good idea, you should just leave the company. You should just quit because they're doomed. And I think that's sort of an extreme example. But I'd like to think that if you go to your leadership, then you can hopefully present to them, hey, there is this alternate way of working and we should just give it a try. Because the outcomes, if we are successful, are so profound that it makes it worth doing.
Okay.
Does that sort of address the question?
I think it does. Okay, one more from Tonic, or Tonic, if we want to read it in Serbian. So, how to let people grow and individually develop themselves, yet to make them taking responsibility for reaching corporate joint goals of the modern...
Amen. Preach on. Oh, I love this question. How do we hold people accountable for entrepreneurial outcomes? There is a discipline which is presented in the Lean Startup and expanded upon in the Startup Way called innovation accounting. And the core idea behind innovation accounting is that the things that we measure need to change. No longer should we be measuring, did you build the thing you were told to build? But do the projects that you work on get the desired outcomes, or did you get learning that helped us move in a direction that was beneficial? Productive failure. So the way that we measure employees shifts from are you building things to are you learning? Now there's a challenge here, and it's probably pretty obvious. If you think about it for a second, the question is, how do we measure learning? Do you measure like the number of experiments that people do? Do you measure like what do you measure to show that that is happening? And what I have used for this for teams at a team level, and what is recommended in the Startup Way, is that you can create a dashboard that shows the critical metrics for a team at any moment in time. And the base level of that dashboard is leading indicators. A leading indicator refers to something that, look, we can't measure ROI yet. The idea is so new, it's so young. There's no revenue. There's no investment that we're getting. There's no return on an investment yet. So the thing that we measure are, perhaps clicks or downloads or people expressing interest. What are the things that would tell us that we're headed in the right direction? And you start to measure things that are more like that than things like, did you build the things that we set out to build? Now, one other thing, and I know I'm stretching the time that I have here to give you as much information as I can, but one other thing I'll mention is that your performance objectives should be directly related to the cultural values of your organization. They should be directly related to the cultural values of your organization. And if what you find is that the cultural values of your organization do not support innovation or entrepreneurial outcomes, then you have identified a really critical problem. And hopefully you can solve that at a team level before you try to solve that at an organization level.
Okay.
Thank you, Elliot.
Thank you
It was
so
really
much.
inspiring. We would invite the audience for a huge round of applause. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Elliot, so much. This is amazing.
Hey, thank you so much. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here today.